Welcome back to our discussion, The Digital Discovery, the Future of Maximizing Your Return on Data, sponsored by Hitachi Vantara Federal here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Dr. Pragyansmita Nayak, the Chief Data Scientist at Hitachi Vantara Federal. Gary Hicks is the Chief Technology Officer, and Kerry Connort is the Senior Director of Services. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were describing a use case in the Navy where they found that thanks to data analytics and the right data sets, that they could save money by cleaning ships more often rather than less often. And on that maintenance idea, huge effort, a huge concern for the military, you have a really interesting case history based on Disney and one of their theme parks and what they were able to discover. Gary, you want to tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really fascinating use case, as me, just like most of your listeners, probably have been to Disney and moved around. And if you think about Disney, one of the great things that they're really good at is moving a lot of people. And if you think about the last time you went to Disney, there's very few rides that are broke down, or people are waiting in line and they put the stanchions up to keep you out. Hitachi Vantara has actually partnered with Disney to do predictive maintenance on some of their rides, because all these rides, just like the ships have sensors, all these rides have sensors, and they can look at the temperature of the wheels, the temperature of the track, how many times has somebody buckled a seatbelt, and start to look at these trends and analyze the sensor data to provide a predictive analytics or predictive maintenance recommendation, so they don't lose rides, so they're not disappointing a lot of people. There, a couple thousand people in line for a new ride and having to shut it down because something broke. They can look at all this in the future and do that predictive maintenance, just like the ship, and really bring it better experience to Disney and their customers.
Yeah, so that's really a mission critical situation then for the application of data science, because in the military setting or any federal setting, that idea of stoppage is something they really want to avoid at all costs, and sounds like they can avoid them at lower cost and rather than at all costs with the right analytics. Which brings me to the next question, and that is getting down to brass tacks. We've talked about the data sets. We've talked about how you have to kind of get your organization aligned to be able to begin to look at these questions. But there's also some technical aspects beyond the data sets, and that is the architecture of your data systems, where you stage these things, how you discover data, how you are able to support multiple users both operationally and in the data analytics realm. So let's discuss what are some of the best practices for the architecture of your systems that support data analytics.
Sure, that's actually one of the very first questions you want to address as you are starting to uh, define the scope of what you are trying to solve using data science. And here I may sound a bit repetitive from my earlier answers, where I stressed on the importance of understanding the why a solution is needed, and it being more problem driven rather than being tools driven. So it's very important to define the scope of what you are trying to accomplish, just because you can go in multiple directions once you start working on a data science focused problem, because there definitely always lot of data from different domains, different parts of your organization that is available, which can be combined as part of your solution, as well as there are multiple tools which can be leveraged for that purpose. So as you can imagine, this just becomes an exponential solution space where you can keep on trying. So it's very important to set objectives as well as set interim milestones, and what are the objectives associated with those interim milestones. And also, with having defined the scope, be prepared for surprises and bad news, because as you do certain phases of your data science solution development, you will learn new things about the data, and that may change the direction in which your project needs to go. So that is even more critical. So it may sound contradictory saying that define your scope and then be prepared for change, but that is the nature of how a typical data science project has I've seen evolve as we start getting more and more insights and more and more better understanding of where we are going with it.
Yeah, so it sounds like you need to have a methodology that does not start with the newest and most sexy sounding tool, which can be enticing, I think, to IT people. But really, you need to know your scope, and then you need to architect your system, and then the proper tool will maybe become manifest. That's a
You
good way to
nailed
put
it.
it.
Yes, you nailed it. It's not just even it's not just the tool, but also like there's certain buzzwords which this decision makers and the stakeholders will hear and be like, how can we use this? And that is where they need to take a step back and say, no, what is the problem we are trying to solve? What are the intricate details around that? And how can that be mapped? Is that even a data science problem, first of all? If yes, then start looking at data science based solutions around it.
Sure. And Carrie, are you able to pull that out of agencies when you deal with them? Because they might be ready to sign on to a tool without really having a thorough understanding of what they hope to get from that tool.
Uh, Absolutely. And actually that happens more often than not. The tool starts to drive the dialogue and you have to, kind of dial it back a little bit. And just expanding on what Dr. P was talking about, the scope is so important because the data problem can get so overwhelming and so complex that if you start too broad or you start to try to, accomplish everything at once, it's going to become, it's not going to be something that you can deal with without getting into the weeds and getting, dragged down into the minutia. It's really important to think about it in, as Dr. P mentioned, milestones, set phases, things that are, milestones that are digestible, achievable. Avoid getting too complex. Start simple. I mentioned that earlier. It's really about, I'll say it again to Dr. P's point of understanding the why. Start there. What are you trying to achieve? And then define the scope in a very specific manner with an end game in mind. But also, to Dr. P's earlier point, you're going to have surprises. There are going to be changes. Be comfortable with that change and let it evolve. So once you start to set those parameters, that scope becomes, kind of your guardrails. You define it, you stick to it, and then you let it evolve as you start to learn, new things as the data starts to unfold. And again, to your point, it's, the tools, they may manifest in themselves. They may try to start with a tool, but once you do that, you start, if you start with the tool, you're not necessarily, I should say, you're limiting yourself to what that tool could potentially do instead of looking at the data and what you need to get out of it and finding a tool that's going to help you, curate that data in a way that's going to be meaningful.
And Gary, from your point of view as a CTO for Hitachi Vantara, then maybe agencies ought to think of this data discovery and data analytics exercise not only as a process or an exercise, and not even just as a project, but maybe as a program in and of itself, from what Carrie was saying.
Yeah, it's definitely a program in and of itself. And what I kind of hear as well is people are very possessive of their data. They have this is my data. But I think one of the things that we want to get to, and I think the federal space needs to get to, is collaboration and sharing of that data across agencies. And that's where that architecture that you put in place becomes even more important. So you have common standards between the different agencies. And it's keeping the data in the right place with, cloud first went to cloud smart. Now it's making sure the data is available for whoever needs it, regardless of its location, whether it's in your private data center on a private cloud or in the public cloud space, making that data available to those cross agency sharing, because there's a huge pool of data out there that we have to deal with. And I think it's important to have every aspect of that data lake, if you will, to really interpret the data appropriately for that use case that you're trying to address.
All right. Describe for me what context intelligence is and how that comes into the whole picture.
Yeah, I think that's important because really that intelligence around the content and the objects that are in place, whether it's a structured database, somebody's social security record or somebody's phone call, whatever it may be, all that becomes interesting data if you look at it in the context of how you analyze it. And what I mean is that object or that piece of data, it has some relevant characteristics. But now, if we start to look at the metadata around that, like where did they call? Who did they call from? Where do they live? We can start to tag that object with associated metadata. Now we have this rich tapestry of data that surrounds this object that really tells us a lot more about it than just if we looked at that one specific object. This, John Doe called in at 5 p.m. and we were able to satisfy his, request for a check, whatever it may be. Now we can understand, oh, well, that agent takes a lot of calls. They take more calls that day. This person called in from a cell phone because it was this number, this exchange. So it's really enriching that data. And that's one of the things that data scientists really kind of look at is not just the data, but that associated metadata around that object. So, and I don't know, Dr. P, if you want to kind of elaborate even more, you're the data scientist. So.
Sure, Gary. Would love to. I would like to add a little bit more context, like in terms of the types of data which one typically thinks of when we're talking about content intelligence is not just restricted to the tabular data or table formatted data that we are almost familiar with, but also the unstructured data and semi-structured data, such as looking at a log file, looking at an image, a video. It is not the image by itself which we are most interested in when we are talking about content intelligence. It is the metadata associated around it. When was it clicked? Who clicked it? What was the purpose of it? And so that your analysis of those unstructured data is not looking at the individual pixels of the image, but the context around it and getting related information of maybe similar images that you're looking for. And enabling that search and making it faster so that the volume of the data, which has been a challenge always, is out of that equation of dealing with these type of unstructured data.
Yeah, so to summarize, we've just got about a minute left. Then really what is needed to tie this all together is what you might call data maturity on the part of federal practitioners. And quickly, what are the 3 steps that they need to do to get to a level, let's say, not of individual so much, but organizational data maturity? Anyone want to tackle that one?
In my experience, and I'm always dealing with the business leaders and the people side of things, in my day to day. And most important that I see is recognizing the need and then aligning the right leader and the right team to drive the evolution of the data. To truly mature it, it shouldn't be a second day job. It shouldn't be an afterthought or a secondary priority and something you do maybe, in the time between meetings that you have. It really needs time and attention, and it needs that energy and that leadership. So having a chief data officer or someone to lead the data effort, if you don't have the opportunity to have a CDO, and then a team of data scientists to understand the tools, the environment to get the most out of the data and perform the analytics. And lastly, I would say controlled and secure data access, most important. You need the data stewards and the data custodians to help you get the data you need, access it, and analyze it for your purposes.
All right, excellent discussion. I want to thank today's guests. We heard from Carrie Connert. She's the Senior Director of Services and Delivery at Hitachi Vantara Federal. Dr. Pragyan Smita Nayak is the Chief Data Scientist at Hitachi Vantara Federal, and Gary Hicks is their Chief Technology Officer. I'm Tom Temin. You've been listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Hitachi Vantara Federal.